have in fact stagnated or even declined for the majority of the population since their peak around 25 years ago. But in the mid-'80s, the effects of the double-edged so-called conservatism of the Reaganites, namely markets for the poor and state protection for the rich, that hadn't yet had its full impact. By 1993, the impact was quite obvious. The Wall Street Journal was able to exult over what it called a welcome development of transcendent importance. Namely, U.S. labor costs had fallen below all other leading industrial powers, apart from England. We actually did fall below England for a while, but then Margaret Thatcher succeeded in driving the working people and the poor down even more efficiently than us. Meanwhile, profits were rising to new heights. Earlier this year, every year, Fortune magazine has the big business magazine, has a review of the Fortune 500, the 500 top guys. And earlier this year, they reported dazzling profits, that's their word, for the 500 top corporations, even though sales were stagnating. So wages are going down, sales are stagnating, and profits are zooming to dazzling heights. Sometimes called a paradox. In fact, if you look at social policy, it's not terribly paradoxical.
Watching Professor Chomsky there from 1994, and he's here in our studios for the next 1 hour and 45 minutes, and we've got calls waiting to talk to him. This one from Omaha, Nebraska. You're on the air, Omaha. Please go ahead.
Yes, I appreciate the opportunity to ask a question. I think it's in line with what was just shown, a little talk you were giving about economics and stuff. I've been pretty deeply interested in socialism over the past 12 years. And, I keep hearing that, socialism is on the rise again in the U.S., at least within the universities and stuff. They say, always saying how all the faculties, out east and west are more and more socialistic. And, I guess I see as kind of the root of all the evil, all this, imperialism and capitalism, economics, creating all these, wars and terrorism, blah, blah, blah. I'd like to hear more of your commentary on, the potential or what's going on, realistically now in the U.S. and the world in terms of a true socialistic movement. In terms of like the working class really taking charge of economics potentially, rather than all this, to me, is what's screwed up versions of what is called socialism, through tax cuts and blah, 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 that they're going to redistribute, that's what you get through the mainstream media, that they're going to create tax cuts and redistribute it, and that's what they call socialism.
Thanks, Omaha.
Well, the tax cuts are a curious kind of socialism. I mean, the tax cuts are intended to and having the effect of redistributing income even more toward the rich than is currently the case. In fact, the tax cuts are pretty clearly part of an effort to destroy the progressive legislation of the past century, including social spending in general, Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, progressive taxes, and so on. That's virtually conceded. I don't know how closely you've been following the business pages in the last couple of days, but it's been revealed that the former Secretary of the Treasury, before he was fired, commissioned a study by the top government economists, Treasury Department, Bureau of the Budget, and so on, to estimate the likely effects of the Bush administration economic programs. That includes a vast increase in federal spending, primarily for the military, which means high-tech industry in general, and tax cuts directed primarily towards the most wealthy sectors, enormous tax cuts. They estimated deficits on the order of $44 trillion. That's a lot of money. That was supposed to be put into the February budget proposals, but didn't appear there. There's a debate about whether that was purposeful or not. Anyway, it's now revealed and conceded. The White House spokesperson, Ari Fleischer, was asked about it in a press conference a couple days ago, and he said, yes, the figures are correct, and then, paraphrasing him, he said something like this. He said, this means that Congress will have to be responsible in reforming Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid. Now, the kind of reform he's talking about is not funding it through reinstituting progressive tax measures, but basically killing it. They know that they cannot approach the population in an election on a platform saying, we're going to eliminate social spending and transfer wealth even more to the wealthy than it is today. But they can, and I think are intending to, drive the country into what a number of economists have called a fiscal train wreck, which will then have the effect of eliminating social spending. So this is about as remote from any, this is, it's government intervention on the for the benefit of the wealthy. Now, as far as socialism is concerned, that term has been so evacuated of content over the last century that it's hard even to use. I mean, the Soviet Union, for example, was called a socialist society, and it was called that by the two major propaganda operations in the world, the US, the Western one, and the Soviet one. They both called it socialism for opposite reasons. The West called it socialism in order to defame socialism by associating it with this miserable tyranny. The Soviet Union called it socialism in order to gain whatever, to benefit from the moral appeal that true socialism had among large parts of the general world population. But this was about as remote from socialism as you can imagine. I mean, the core notion of at least traditional socialism is that what you mentioned, that working people have to be in control of production and communities have to be in control of their own lives and so on. And you know, this goes, the Soviet Union was the exact opposite of that. Working people had no control over anything. They were virtual slaves. And the collapse of the Soviet Union is in fact a small victory for socialism, in my opinion. It eliminated one of the major barriers to it and should have been recognized as such. But the term has been, as I said, become so meaningless that it's hard even to use. If we use it in the traditional sense, which you brought up, that goes straight back in American history. You read the working class press in the mid-19th century, press published by artisans and what were called factory girls, young women from the farms working in the textile mills in eastern Massachusetts, which was the center of beginning of the Industrial Revolution. Their press was calling for, they said their theme was that those who work in the mills ought to own them. Wage labor, which was called wage slavery, was regarded by most Americans as not very different from slavery. Even the Republican Party regarded wage labor as just at best a preliminary to free labor, but intolerable because it's a kind of servitude. A large part of the northern population fighting the Civil War was fighting under that banner. This goes straight through the 20th century, the idea that people should be in control of their own destinies and lives, including the institutions in which they work, the communities in which they live, and so on. Call it what name you want, but that's traditional socialism. And there are today attempts to describe a kind of a detailed vision of the future based on these notions. The most extensive and detailed one I know is by Michael Albert at ZNet, which you mentioned. It's participatory economics, and there are other such proposals. But I think this is deeply ingrained in people's understanding and consciousness and barely below the surface. In fact, it's a call for essentially extension of democracy to the industrial sphere and to communities as well. We should also bear in mind that the leading American social philosopher, John Dewey, who's as mainstream as apple pie, His main work was concentrated on democracy. He pointed out over and over again that as long as we have what he called industrial feudalism, that is a tyrannical control, private power controlling production commerce, democracy will be very limited. We have to move to what he called industrial democracy if we hope to have significant democracy. As for politics, his position was that until that happens, politics will be the shadow cast over society by big business, and I think most of the population recognizes that and accepts it.
New York City, good afternoon.
Good afternoon. Yes, hello, Dr. Chomsky. I heard you refer to your early experiences with Zionism. I imagine a more universal and idealistic Zionism from that period. And I was wondering if you could speak on the evolution of your relationship with Zionism and the State of Israel. And also, perhaps if you could speak on what your vision might be for an Israel maybe drawing on that more optimistic early Zionism, and how the process of getting to that vision differs from Oslo, Clinton, and Barack in 2000, and now the roadmap.
Well, this will have to be brief, but in this book that was mentioned before, Middle East Illusions, there's a lot of discussion of that. Some of the essays there go back to over 35 years, up to the present. But to try to put it briefly, at the time when I was a Zionist youth leader, an activist back in the 1940s. But for me, Zionism meant opposition to a Jewish state, and that was a recognized, accepted part of the Zionist movement. By no means a majority, but it was a position within what was called the Zionist movement, opposition to a Jewish state. And I think the reasons for that were good. The same reasons why I'd be opposed to a Christian state or a white state or an Islamic republic. Same reasons. A state should be a state of its citizens, and not of some privileged category of its citizens. And the State of Israel, incidentally, by Harcourt ruling, is the state of the Jewish people in Israel and in the diaspora, but not of its citizens. And I'm opposed to that. I've always been opposed to it. So in that respect, my views haven't changed. If this was merely a matter of symbolism, it wouldn't matter much. So the fact that the United States has a day off on Sunday, okay, doesn't make it a Christian state in any sense that matters. But if there were special privileges for Christians or whites or others, it would be a different matter. Then I think we should be opposed to it, and that's true in Israel. After the establishment of the state in 1948, which the issue of the existence of Israel was essentially over as far as I'm concerned. It should have the rights of any state in the international system. I don't think states have many legitimate rights, but that's another story. But whatever rights you accord to any state in the international system, okay, Israel should have those rights. It should be democratic internally, meaning the state of its own citizens, not of the majority of them and other Jews elsewhere. After 1967, the situation changed radically. In 1967, Israel conquered the West Bank, Sinai, Gaza, and the Golan Heights. And since that time, it's now the 36th year of a quite harsh and brutal occupation, in which time Israel, when I say Israel, I mean the United States and Israel, because just about everything Israel does is by U.S. authorization and with U.S. Diplomatic, military, and economic support. They can't go much beyond what the U.S. authorizes. And what they have done is move to integrate the West Bank, particularly, into Israel to the extent that they want it. So there are massive settlement programs which have broken the West Bank into cantons, effectively. And to get quickly to the Clinton-Barack programs at Camp David, They were you should take a look at the map of what was proposed. It's rather striking that while